Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Matt Armstrong, who is a former governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is now called the U.S. Agency for Global Media. He is also a former executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, and he is a PhD student at King's College London, writing on the United States' failure to institutionally oppose Russian political warfare from 1945 to 1965. Matt Armstrong, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
To our audience, today's discussion is a sprawling topic, which is quite frankly a little challenging to distill into bite-sized nuggets. But if there's anybody who can help see through this topic, Matt Armstrong is that person. And so today's discussion is going to center around a topic that a lot of people might not be terribly familiar with, the Smith-Mundt Act, and the whole concept of public diplomacy and United States engagement with the world. So Matt, I think it might be helpful as a point of reference to define the term public diplomacy, if we can start out there, please.
Sure, that's certainly not starting off with the easy question, because the problem with the term public diplomacy is that it came into use to define the activities of an agency rather than be a label for programs, for methods, means, or outcomes. And this appropriation of the term, the taking of this term, which in the 1950s was used to perhaps ironically describe Russian activities of speaking to the press before or after a diplomatic conversation, usually with the US, in order to shape public opinion about a particular conversation, knowing that their State Department counterparts would not do any such thing. The term public diplomacy came to be used in the mid to late 60s to defend the United States Information Agency, which was under threat. Its independence was under threat because its relevance and value to the national security apparatus was questioned. There were suggestions from 1957 onward that it should be remerged into the State Department if certain things didn't happen. And so the result was this term public diplomacy became used as a counter to State Department's diplomacy. Fast forward through the decades, and because the term was applied to an agency rather than methods, means, outcomes, we have this great deal of confusion in the post-1999 world, which is when USIA was abolished and most of its functions were returned into the State Department, that only a part of the State Department does public diplomacy, again, irrespective of means, methods, outcomes of a particular program or engagement policy, whatever it is. So in the early part of this century, when there was a new Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, was ostensibly the replacement for the Director of United States Information Agency when USIA was abolished, there was this interesting parlor game among academics of, hey, with this new Undersecretary, let's see how they will define public diplomacy. Because for the first bunch of undersecretaries, that definition would be changed each and every time. For my money, public diplomacy should go away because it's a term of segregation, not integration. But if we need to create a definition, it is those activities that intend to understand, inform, and influence foreign audiences.
Okay, thank you for that. And so also to help anchor this conversation, would it be fair to say that in general, this discussion aligns with capabilities associated with the Department of State? Would you say that that's fair as a very general anchoring point?
If we're talking about public diplomacy, yes, in general. That breaks down, particularly in the last nearly 20 years, as other agencies have taken more responsibility, whether intentionally or not, in informing, engaging, and influencing people outside of the United States in an overt way.
So we read in your bio just a moment ago that you were on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is now the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and the acronym for that is USAGM. A few months back, we had a gentleman, Tom Kent, on the podcast, whom I believe you know, Matt. And so Tom was the president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty from 2016 to 2018. Could you give our audience a refresher on what the U.S. Agency for Global Media is, and how these other organizations such as Radio Free Europe relate to USAGM?
Sure. So I know Tom Kent. He's a good man. I think he did a good job at RFERL. I was actually on the hiring committee and interviewed him for the job of president, and I supported him for that job. And again, I think he did a great job. So with regard to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or BBG, now since 2018 or 2017, no, 2018, I believe, they renamed to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which I'll get to in a minute, why that was a fair change of name. I think it's important to step back. So I earned a Master of Public Diplomacy. I taught in that same graduate program public diplomacy courses and government organization in support of these international engagement and influence operations. I was served, as you mentioned in the bio, in an oversight / advocacy role for these activities that included then BBG as the executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. I've written articles and book chapters on this issue, but it wasn't until I was a governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors that I actually understood what BBG did and what it was, which is in some ways appalling and yet understandable, because here's an agency that had been poorly managed in many respects and who did not like to publicly engage, because anytime you put your head up, it's going to get whacked. And so I'm not surprised that many people do not know what BBG and thus USAGM is. In fact, I would argue in a conversation of public diplomacy, there's a strong argument that I make that it's not part of public diplomacy, and I'll get into that. In short, USAGM, as it's known now, has 6 major operations. There are the broadcast entities, Voice of America, or VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, otherwise RFERL, Radio Free Asia, RFA, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, OCB, and Middle East Broadcast Network, MBN. And that 6th is this internet freedom, which I prefer to refer to as information freedom component, which is for chiefly tools and methods to break through barriers of censorship and monitoring online. But it's not just the internet. They have other tools as well. So those are the main things. Now, those operations have different missions and sometimes overlapping geographies, target audiences. And yet, even when they overlap, they have a different responsibility to their audiences and a different relationship to their audiences. For example, VOA in Myanmar versus Radio Free Asia in Myanmar are have totally different subjects that they're covering, and thus have a different relationship. In the shorthand, it would be VOA is talking about national politics and regional relations, whereas Radio Free Asia is talking about the potholes and the local issues at the local level. So much so that when I was in Myanmar quite a bit ago for BBG, the VOA and RFA reporters just never saw each other because their beats were so radically different. But all of these entities are surrogate operations. They target specific countries that in a shorthand that your audience will understand. These operations target markets where SOCOM is, has been, or will be. In other words, these are surrogate media operations providing news and information to markets that do not have free access to news and information, that are under autocratic rule, sometimes very bad conditions. And so these USAGM properties have a very discrete mission in discrete places. They're not targeting France, Canada, Germany. It's a different type of operation. And it's generally where US media just simply won't go. Now, even if, say, CNN International is available in Indonesia, it's not covering Indonesian events and stories that are important to the Indonesian people. It's probably doing a broadcast in English, and it's probably just pushing news there rather than doing local coverage for the local people. And this is what makes VOA to RFA to RFE a surrogate station for the media that is not otherwise there for whatever reason.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. So that's today, right? So perhaps we can now rewind the clock about 75 years to the immediate post-World War II timeframe. Could you describe what was happening during that time period and start taking that into the reason for creating the Smith-Mundt Act in the first place?
Yeah, so at the end of 44, the State Department finally comes around and realizes they need a coordinator for global engagement, called global affairs, public affairs. And I'm using the word global intentionally. This isn't non-US versus US. This person, the Assistant Secretary for Public and Cultural Relations, as it was titled, was in charge of the department's international and domestic information activities, coordinating policy with other agencies. And of the appointment of this Assistant Secretary, he initiates a project to look at the government's post-war international program needs. What do we need to do? Concurrently and incidentally, a congressman introduces a bill that he had actually introduced 2 years earlier, but it was a bad time, to exchange student to teachers, that is, teachers in training at the primary and secondary level, between what was then called the American republics, which are the countries of North and South America, to increase this mutual understanding, create ties between people. And this Assistant Secretary gets a hold of this bill from a fellow named Dean Acheson, who holds this Congressman, Carl Mundt, in high esteem, high regard. And they start working this. The Assistant Secretary is Archibald MacLeish, who had run one of the offices that became the Office of War Information prior to the war. And this report In 6 months, it's done. It's a high-level interagency look, deep dive, 241 pages, lays out several recommendations, options, as a matter of fact, different scenarios. And this drives the president's structure of an executive order abolishing the Office of War Information and delegating the international information programs of the Office of War Information and the Office of Inter-American Affairs to the State Department on August 31, 1945, prior to the USS Missouri rolling into Tokyo Bay. So what was happening was, we need an international information program, because if we don't tell our story, and our story wasn't, this is why Americans are happy in the US, but this is our foreign policy, this is who we are for the purpose of understand why our foreign policy is this way. We're not here to eat babies or to rob and pillage, but this is what we're seeking. To generally counter misinformation and implicitly counter disinformation. But as 46 comes around, it becomes this legislation which would have passed the House by a 2/3 vote, but failed to get introduced in the Senate for purely partisan reasons. The threat from Russia starts to rise. And so when the bill is reintroduced in the 80th Congress, the Republican, quote, do-nothing Congress as named by Truman, because of its opposition to everything he does, they take a hold of this bill. And Mundt, being a Republican, they get a Republican in the Senate to now co-sponsor this and usher it through the Senate, which they didn't have in the previous Congress, somebody ushering it through. It evolves because of the Russian activities, including their aggression in Greece, in Turkey, Poland, Romania, Iran, Korea, other places. In fact, if we recall Truman's speech that is known as the launching the Truman Doctrine, he calls out Russia for their aggression and says very plainly that this Russian aggression in these countries is no different than the reason we went to war with Germany and Japan. And this acceleration of these Russian activities, which is not just pure military, the Smith-Mundt bill evolves from, let's just get our story out there and information out there and tell people who we really are and what our foreign policy really is, because otherwise, how is anybody going to know? It becomes more of a counter disinformation. In fact, I argue, and I don't think there's any reason that anybody can argue otherwise, it is one of the first pieces of legislation opposing Russian political warfare, preparing the United States. And so I think it's important because at that time, like today, you had a borderless, stateless threat. We look back on that period and we focus on US versus USSR as if the late 1940s and 50s is just like the 1970s, and it wasn't. These were stateless entities, agents, pseudo-agents, wannabe agents, opposing independent governments. And this is what Smith-Mundt was born from. And in fact, part of this, it relates to the European Reconstruction Program, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan, because there was the realization that this is great. As Mundt said in an article, which actually was based on a congressional report, we are feeding European, I'm paraphrasing slightly, only slightly, while we are feeding European stomachs, the Russians are feeding their minds. Mm. And we're going to be in a position where we're going to have healthy Europeans turned against us. Mm. And then he says, we will be incredibly stupid if we allow that to happen. And so part of the impetus to push through Smith-Mundt is the Marshall Plan needs an information program to break through the disinformation and misinformation propagated in part by Russia and its agents. So there's an interesting parallel between then and now with that regard. What's broken, and is not a parallel, is we had an understanding of what we wanted tomorrow to look like. And today we don't. And I would argue I don't know when the last time we had an understanding. Most of our policy can be distilled down to stop it, to the status quo or status quo ante. And that's not what the situation was then. And so Smith-Mundt is born of this political warfare. I don't like the term information warfare, but it's popular environment. And it was a much more comprehensive set of tools, authorizing a massively comprehensive set of tools that goes well beyond our common understanding of what, quote, public diplomacy covers today.
Okay, so thanks for all of that. And there's so many different directions that we can go with this. So there's two items that I guess I'd like to follow up on. One is your observation, your assertion that today we are lacking the focus that you were articulating in the post-World War II period, number one. And number two, the fact that the Russians back in the post-World War II period, they were already engaging in information and political warfare in a way that caught us by surprise, or we were having to react to. And my understanding is that the Russians' political warfare and information warfare tactics go back well before World War II.
We have perverted this stuff over the decades to the point that the struggle that you're having right now is completely understandable, and this is part of the problem. Let me give you something else to help illustrate that problem. In the research for my book, and I've presented on this, I did a presentation on this a couple of times, including earlier this year. In 1917, but it became public in 1918, the US Army War College, which was then essentially a think tank for the Army General Staff, which was the advisory group for the Secretary of War. I'm simplifying a bit, so experts don't jump on me about that. They devised that, you know what, there's a lot more to war than simply combat power. There are these political elements, there's the combat elements, there's also this economic element, and there's also the psychologic, as they called it, psychologic element. There are literary forces that are engaged. The stuff is too important, quote, to be left to the military alone, end quote. Mm-hmm. And US Army military intelligence was actually organized around that four-part political, economic, combat, and psychologic structure in 1917, 1918, and you see this right up in 1919. PPCE or CEPP, I've used both, I kind of like PPCE, whatever. And so we understood the psychologic element, right? Your listeners, you may recognize that this looks a lot like D for diplomatic, I for information, M for military, E for economics, DIME. Mm-hmm. The problem is, as Americans, for some reason, or at least Americans associated and close to near government, we want to come up with terms that ascribe bureaucratic responsibility. Public diplomacy, which we've already talked about, is a perfect example of that. I was literally, not figuratively, yelled at several times earlier in this century how only a part of the State Department did public diplomacy. Defense Department did not do public diplomacy. Private military companies operating in Iraq, even though they were influencing public opinion about the United States, had nothing to do with public diplomacy because they weren't part of the State Department program. Bureaucratic responsibility. And we see that today with certain other terms. I think hybrid warfare is a term that could be put in the same way. But it's interesting. So with D, it's diplomatic, whereas P is political. P is not necessarily strictly State Department and diplomats, whereas D is tightly aligned with the foreign ministry. And information, is a generic term. What is information, right? Its sheer existence has no value. Psychologic has an implication of action and intent. And I think with our terms, we've lost these things and we've lost the importance. And the reason why I bring that up is that the Army developed that and 4 years ago, give or take. And we're still trying to figure this out because we've forgotten about these things. And so what should our policy look like? How do we organize this? Should we create the organization because that will affect policy? Does organization equal strategy? Or does organization follow strategy? And part of the problem is we're confused about those issues. And I think part of the problem is we forget the informational element of policy and actions have equal value. In fact, in the statement of political, combat power, economic, and psychological power, they framed it as combat, economic, political power in this one sentence because the fourth, psychologic, is co-equal with the others. And that's from a document, an Army General Staff document of 1918 or 1919, I forget. I don't think we have that same understanding today. Information is incidental. We don't prioritize it in the same way. In fact, for example, the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, that office was established in 1999. I mentioned earlier that every time there was this parlor game, that every time there was a new undersecretary, how are they going to define public diplomacy? In other words, how are they going to define their job? How will they define their job? And it was always an interesting game of how it came about. But that job has been unencumbered, the technical term, has not had a confirmed occupant, Senate confirmed occupant, 40% of the time since 1999. 2 out of every 5 workdays, there's nobody in that office. How do we argue that we prioritize these issues? If the Chief International Information Operations Officer of the State Department is unhired and left to do whatever they want to do. And this is a side note, has actually very little authority. They actually have less authority over posts and activities abroad than the USIA director did, or the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs between 1945 and 1953, when this stuff was stripped out of the State Department. So that is a incredibly long-winded, and I apologize, version of your confusion over this, and you're struggling to frame a question is completely understandable because this is essentially a concept that's foreign to our makeup. And even in the military side, our prioritization of the psychological operations officers who are the trained communicators, that prioritization isn't there. In fact, you have the breakdown between the reserve and the active corps, and the way that inhibits institutionalized leadership and activity. You have the terminal ranks of colonel. Similar is the foreign area officer, who are the experts in these particular locales. They have a terminal opportunity as well, or limits. And it's more likely that the public affairs officer, or even the JAG, is going to have the ear of the combatant commander at whatever level, whether it's brigade or above, then the PSYOP officer will. If the PSYOP officer is even available, which is not considered a strategic resource. So even in the defense side, which is where IPA is notionally much more involved, there's not an institutional understanding for these information activities. And in fact, that's one reason why IPA exists, is to elevate this understanding and awareness. So as the whole of government is concerned, we're really messed up. I mentioned earlier Department of Interior. The reason why was they ran, I'm out of date, I'm sure they still do, but I don't know. They were running programs for counter in Africa, the term poachers, counter poacher campaigns. And this is increasing relationship with foreign countries, because there are all sorts of effects of this poaching, negative, bad effects. And that should be considered public diplomacy. But we don't even think of it as an influence operation. Most people don't. And it's Department of Interior. They don't do public diplomacy. So, one last point, for example, foreign aid. Foreign aid. I love the fact that at one time, the manager of our foreign aid, before the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was created, the thing that managed this stuff was called the Mutual Security Agency. How's that for understanding the purpose of foreign aid? Whereas today, I don't think most people understand why it's there. And I think we have the same defect in the people that are affecting these programs in some way, because they're not held to account for that. And the same issue is within this public diplomacy. I used to poll people, what is your definition of public diplomacy? And often from within the public diplomacy field, I would get, it's to create a relationship, period. That has nothing to do, and with that wording has nothing to do with national security. And yet the whole reason this stuff exists, the reason why Smith-Mundt exists, is to be a tool of national security. And in your discussions, not your personally, but in the broader academic and policy discussions of national security legislation, you have the National Security Act of 1947, but you don't have the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948. That was just as much, if not more, a tool of national security. And yet we don't think of those things. It's not what we do. Academia skips past it. Practitioners have have a gross misunderstanding of what this is.
Okay, thanks for all of that, Matt, and trying to cut through my confusion. So you are describing some dynamics from the post-World War II period, which also included a sense of urgency, but also a very recent recollection of what happened during World War II. And all of this post-World War II activity is not happening statically. It was a dynamic world back in the late 1940s. It seems that the United States got its act together relatively quickly in order to put together this public diplomacy and world engagement apparatus under the State Department. What are some of the lessons learned that we can take from the post-World War II period into today? And also, I'd love for you to comment on whether or not you think that we have a working vision of what America's role in the world is currently. And I'd love to get your recommendations for what we should do now in order to address the challenges that we face.
I think there are three different elements to the question. The first has to do with implicitly about the Smith-Mundt, the act of getting this stuff together under the State Department. That took a bit longer than it should have. We would be talking about the Bloom bill if the Senate Republican leadership did not object on its face the bill to authorize this international engagement by the State Department in July 1946. Mm-hmm. The Senate Republican leadership just said, nope, this is a Democrat plan. We just aren't even going to talk about it in the Senate, period, end of story. Those same people came to support it in the 80th Congress when the bill was reintroduced at the request of the State Department, because they still needed these authorities. And it languished until the senators, it passed the House in the first time by 2/3, then it passed the House the second time by 3/4 vote. And it was languishing in the Senate. Not languishing is not the right word. The Senate keep taking this up. But as senators themselves admitted, they were, and I'm paraphrasing, they were striving for the perfect, and they decided that let's just pass this and we will amend it later with the things we want. And they did. Mm-hmm. And you had this Republican-led Congress, House, and Senate under a Democrat president that they really didn't like. And they still passed this bill. So it took some time, but that's an artificially lengthened time to some degree. But they did it. And the State Department, these people that helped push it through, they moved on. In fact, Dean Acheson, in his autobiography years later, talks about how the department muffed its opportunity here. And they really had a problem. And they failed to do this job. And so it gets taken out into a separate entity, as I talked about, IIA, International Information Administration, USIA, United States Information Agency, which I see as a failure of leadership because they did not fix the foreign ministry to do the job it was charged with. Mm-hmm. So, and that was even under Eisenhower with Truman and then Eisenhower. So we had problems, but even though we had leadership, there was limits to that leadership and the ability to change the institutional culture of the State Department. Okay, fine, whatever. Move through time. The nature of the Cold War changes and goes from lowercase to uppercase, proper noun, Cold War. But we had some kind of vision of what we wanted tomorrow to look like. I think we did change our vision from being highly principled when Truman was in office to the enemy of our enemy is our friend. I don't care if you're democratically principled or not. You're the enemy of my enemy, therefore I'll support you, which created some problems. Fine. But we had a vision. I don't think today, as I mentioned, we have that vision. We don't know what we want the nation's role to be. It's tough. I think you can argue that the Oval Office and supporters have a vision, but there has been a problem in articulating that vision and holding accountable senior leadership below that to that vision. The militarization of US foreign policy, I think, is an example of failing to understand what we want tomorrow to look like. It goes back to the stop it policy. That's what the military force is going to be about. And again, a leadership failure to support the State Department and help it change in the direction that we need it to. Let me, on a footnote on that, we lament that there are fewer foreign service officers than military band members or military lawyers, not appreciating that means they don't have the training float, that is the ability to go into training programs, but also not acknowledging that in this time of, quote, information warfare, the information officers, the public diplomacy officers at the State Department, the cultural officers at the State Department, the locally engaged staff who are great information officers on the ground, are a tiny subset of those FSOs. Mm-hmm. And so if we've been in this information war for the last 20 years, how come we're not upsizing our cadre of people? How come we're not training and equipping these people? How come they have to rely on a Defense Department team to come in and bring photocopy paper so they can run the printers? It seems like we don't have a proper understanding and a proper leadership backing, which starts with the secretary and moves on down. Actually starts with the president and moves on down. So if we look at examples of activity, whether it's the I just blanked on the name, the 1980s entity to counter disinformation. Oh well. These operations relied on the president, but once the president moves on, the initiative moves on. Mm-hmm. So it requires the president. The president needs to articulate and hold accountable these people, as well as giving them support. And we're not seeing that. And so you see arguments of, hey, let's just create a structure. If you build it, they will come. Let's create this entity, and that will manufacture some kind of strategy or action. But that's not the way this works. All that does is continue to segregate an activity that must be core to every other activity. You can't rip out the informational component of the Defense Department, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Homeland Security Department on down the road. They all have to integrate the informational element into their policies, into their actions. Inculcate and support. To support risk tolerance, not risk aversion.
Right.
But to do that, you need to know what I'm working toward. What are we trying to do? And because we don't have, I believe, a comprehensive strategy, we have these silos in operation, sometimes competing with each other, but trying to keep their head down, trying to avoid risk. And so it's not just strategy, it's the communication of what do we want to attempt. So you don't have to have an elegantly articulated strategy, but a basic vision and a direction, and then support the people to march toward that direction. For the IPA audience, right? Commander's intent. There needs to be commander's intent. And then backstopping those people, holding them accountable, but at the same time, allowing them to make a mistake. Allow them to experiment. Right. Because our adversaries have a high degree of risk tolerance. In fact, they have relatively little care for risk. In fact, Russia, for example, they don't care about risk. They don't care if their programs get outed as being Russian programs. There's virtually no punishment, at least no meaningful punishment to have them stop. So so where does America sit? Well, yes, we have to have an understanding of where we want to be. What do we want tomorrow to look like? To adopt the term from Galula, what do we want tomorrow to look like? I'm unable to articulate what I think our nation's leaders want tomorrow to look like, besides a really warm and fuzzy people not fighting each other and democratic principles. But let me scratch that, democratic principles. And because we don't have this articulated vision of some kind, we don't know what price we're willing to pay or extract from friends, allies, adversaries to achieve that vision, which means we can't charge our people and support our people to execute. So, right. Yeah, so we're left with success despite the system, because we've got great, talented people making do with substandard support and substandard tools. Now imagine what we could achieve if we properly equipped and backed them with a policy and tools and staff. Things might be better. Our adversaries are playing this information game because it's cheap and easy. And they're very risk tolerant, so they can throw out a bunch of efforts, and we struggle because of primarily risk aversion, secondary because of strategy. But even then, we're reactive to the adversary. We let the adversary set the time, tempo, manner, place, method of engagement. We're not out in front. So with regard to Smith-Mundt, so the perversion of Smith-Mundt started with Senator Fulbright in the 60s. And it became part of legislation in 72. And what he did was restrict access, amended the law to restrict access to the material authorized by Smith-Mundt. Although he was attacking Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which were not yet merged, as well as Voice of America. And he wanted all these things to shut down. And this helped taint Smith-Mundt and thus public diplomacy because of the arguments to defend USIA. USIA was public diplomacy. Smith-Mundt was USIA, therefore it was public diplomacy, and thus blocking access to USIA material because it's, quote, propaganda, means public diplomacy is propaganda, right? In 1985, Senator Zirinsky is upset at USIA, in part because the USIA director spent about $35,000 of agency funds on a home security system, which boggles my mind that in 1985, you could spend over $30,000 on a home security system, and he was using agency funds to do this. But also, Zirinsky was upset at nepotism, various other things. He also apparently was confusing an office that Otto Reich had set up in the State Department called the Office of Public Diplomacy with USIA, even though Otto Reich had nothing to do with USIA. All these issues, and he, quote, closed the loopholes of Fulbright. But Zirinsky said the American taxpayer doesn't want to be propagandized by their own money. And Zirinsky's law amendment led a federal court to rule that USIA material was exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests, which helped solidify that USIA's public diplomacy is propaganda unfit for American people, right? You get into 99 and USIA goes away. USIA people are now in state, and they argue stridently that the Smith-Mundt firewall is the only thing protecting their ability to communicate with foreign audiences, because if you take away this firewall, State Department will only talk to Americans and not be engaging abroad. This is false. But then you have, after 9/11, you have the State Department failing to engage effectively audiences abroad. I kind of touched on some of this earlier. And so you have the Defense Department starting to take up. In fact, there's a Defense Department memo, a legal memo it's actually remarkably late. I think it was 2011. I would have thought it would have been earlier, but it was surprisingly late, that effectively said, hey, we're kind of doing the State Department job in this international information space, and that's covered by Smith-Mundt. So therefore, we must be covered by Smith-Mundt until Congress tells us otherwise, which is kind of absurd on its face because the Defense Department activities are Title 10 and Title 50. And this Smith-Mundt is Title 22, Foreign Affairs. And it specifically names State Department, USIA, Broadcasting Board of Governors. At any part of the legislation, it reads as if it's 1948 to 1953 or 53 to 99 or post 99. It's never been properly cleaned up to reflect the present day. It never mentions any other agency but this. It's very specific. And yet DOD somehow thinks that this Title 22 legislation applies to them and their Title 10 or Title 50 activities, which is absurd in its face. And in fact, if you read any of these academic law review journal articles, they never resolve this issue. And so Thornberry passes the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012-2013, which I helped write and helped defend in the passage of it, which basically says, no, Defense Department, this does not apply to you. Stop pretending it does. And yet we still, because we misunderstand these things, because there's not a proper history, because we're so hung up on these Fulbrightian concept of the stuff is illegal propaganda, as opposed to methods, means, outcomes. And the fact that why would we be lying to audiences, particularly those that smell propaganda much better than the American audience? Why would we be doing that? We get caught up, and so we use Smith-Mundt to say what we can't do, even if it doesn't apply whatsoever. So there is this really interesting issue over at DOD that I'm hearing again, oh, we can't do something because of Smith-Mundt. It doesn't apply to them. In fact, there was an amendment passed specifically to tell DOD this doesn't apply to you. So this goes into this broader element of this conversation of the gross misunderstanding of the role of information in our foreign policy and the aggressive effort to stick with no because of risk aversion rather than how do we find success and how do we get to yes. I was actually told that NATO was denied permission to use a VOA film because an American audience might see it. NATO wanted to run it on their TV station. I don't know that any American in the US would do that, watch that.
Mm.
I was also in Berlin when I was told that, yes, an American official was told not to go on local radio because an American might hear it. It was absurd.
Mm. Wow.
So this goes into this broader issue area, separating domestic and foreign, as if the US is Las Vegas, or rather outside the US is Las Vegas. It just doesn't come back.
Mm.
And I mentioned earlier that when this stuff got set up, the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs had global US and non-US in their portfolio. Why would you separate? It's just not available to you because it's in a foreign language. But if you want access to it, let us know. In fact, Congress intended that because having the American press and public see what was being said and done in their name was an additional layer of oversight.
Mm.
But this has been distorted by countless law review articles, which I've got a couple of things. I'm trying to write some things about that. This is part of the book. So anyway, I just wanted to touch on the Smith-Mundt element. One, I think is because I'm expected to, but two, because of the disinformation that's around it, which is ironic because the Smith-Mundt Act is to counter disinformation. Mm-hmm. And yet it is subject to an incredible amount of disinformation and misinformation. Mm. The lack of understanding of these tools and these capabilities is ridiculous. So for example, I was at Stuttgart visiting AFRICOM and UCOM. I was the governor of BBG. And I sat in for a bit on the side of a war game that was going on for AFRICOM. And they had established their own broadcast station in servicing some countries in Western Africa. And I asked, why? Mm-hmm. And they said they had queried the posts the State Department posts, the embassies and the consulates in the area, for the local media. And the AFRICOM determined that these resources were inadequate for their needs. So they determined that they needed to set up their own radio station. But Voice of America has a dominant position, truly dominant position in these countries. Mm. In some countries, if I'm remembering correctly, they have well over 50% of the market share of these countries. They are the major media. But this was completely unknown to these guys. Mm. And, so they created their own entity. Why? You have a government resource. Yeah. It's perfectly available to you.
Right hand, left hand, I guess, huh?
And you have there's this creation of the SETimes.com and the Maghrebia Times.com, which were truly news sites. But the combatant commanders, UCOM and AFRICOM, created these sites so that they had a channel to local audiences when they needed to do command information of some kind, or when they needed to direct information. SETimes.com came about because in the Balkans War, there was no perceived viable way of countering Milosevic and other disinformation campaigns. So they set up SETimes.com. So when a situation arose, they could get information out. Okay, why couldn't RFERL do that? Why did it have to be Defense Department thing? In fact, I was involved with Congress to do a pilot project to bring that over into BBG. Now, why wasn't it State Department with the Bureau of International Information Programs, IIP, which is the largest rump of USIA until it was decimated in state? Why couldn't they do it? Well, they're like, screw you, Defense. You want to have too much control over this. I'm not going to do this. There's a leadership problem there, right? And so you allow not only redundancy, but fratricide to some degree, because you're taking away your dilution of audiences. So you're there's a term for that, not fratricide, informational fratricide. It's not the right word. Cannibalism. You're cannibalizing market share from your own resource, most likely. And, you know, as far as SE Times and Maghrebia Times, and there was a third one too, were concerned, you had the Defense Department contracting to, I think it was GDI, General Dynamics Information, whatever the I stood for. So you're contracting out. Now, do you suppose that contract operation was cheap? Cheaper than, say, BBG? I really doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
You're outsourcing this capability. Why don't you just keep it inside? So you get all these, you know, and the AFRICOM guys, okay, they became aware. They rotate on. New people have no idea.
Right.
You know, another anecdote I share is I was part of this strategic communications capabilities assessment. I was also part of a strategic PSYOP capabilities-based assessment. But this SCCBA, I would speak and there'd be like 300 people in the room, 250 people in the room. And I'd point out, this DoD conference, that the only person from State Department was, what was his rank at the time? Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so. He's not a State Department person. He was detailed to state.
Right, he's a liaison.
But he's there.
Yeah.
And why? Because State didn't have or didn't want to send a person to this interagency conference, primarily DoD. So you don't have this relationship. I was speaking at Phoenix Challenge a bunch of years ago, right? IPA just had or is just about to have, I forgot the dates.
Yeah, no, we just
Phoenix Challenge.
Just had it, yeah.
So I spoke at one 15 years ago. I don't remember what it was. And I pointed out there's one person from the State Department in this. And the reason why she was there, she was on detail to Air University. That was the only reason she could be there.
Which university?
Air University. You know, there's Naval War College, there's Army War College, there's Air University.
Ah, gotcha. All right, yes. Mm-hmm.
She was detailed to that. That was the only reason she was there. She was the only person from State Department in the room.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know something, yeah, I think I'm going to just include all of this in the podcast as well, including what I'm saying right now. Yeah, so your take on all of this is, I think, you could safely say it's generally a critique of how we are currently navigating things. Could you maybe, you know, help like steelman the other side just a little bit? Like what are we doing positively currently, either at the president level or at the Department of State level? What are some things that people listening to this would say, yeah, but, you know, we've got these good things going for us, you know? So, I mean, just to help present the other perspective just a little bit, because surely it can't all be negative.
Yeah, no, and I don't mean to say it's all negative. The phrase I have often used is, we are successful despite ourselves. We have great and talented people that are ill supported, and yet they are still successful and they still have an impact.
Do you think that's partly because of the inertia that the United States has in the world, and that for, you know, since the Cold War ended in the early 90s, we have been the most influential, you know, nation state on the planet, and somehow that inertia is helping to spackle over whatever deficiencies we have currently?
I think there's an element to that, and I think that spackle is wearing incredibly thin, and not just because of the policies of the previous 4 years, but going further back. You know, there's the story of USIA being abolished, and what's missing from the common story that, oh, it was the peace dividend, We didn't have an enemy anymore. You hear that story. We didn't have an enemy, therefore we didn't need USIA. Well, it was more of the peace dividend. And the reality is there were two agencies on the chopping block, and one was going to lose their head. And USAID's chief was more aggressive. And we know what happened to the other one, USIA. Now, what is lost in there is that why should we have thought that public opinion was no longer a critical element of US foreign policy and national security, or was of such low priority that who we are, what our policy is, and all that sort of stuff was self-evident and didn't need direct support, right? Because when USI was abolished, there wasn't a comprehensive view study, as I mentioned, and as I raised in these other books, whether it's that 6-month International Information Program of the US or the Overseas Information Service of the US government. There was not a comprehensive study over, or even of the studies that took place recommending the abolishment of USIA from the late 50s through the mid 70s, if it didn't get properly integrated into foreign policy. You didn't have that in the 90s. You just had, we don't need this anymore. So we kind of walked away from understanding and appreciating the role of foreign policy and the success or failure of our policies. So there was a bunch of assumptions. And what we found was a guy in a cave could out-communicate us because we were just assuming that who we were self-evident. An argument that was tossed aside as ridiculous in 1946, because that was made in opposition to the Smith-Mundt bill. We don't need this information program because who we are is self-evident. Another congressman said that to sell us abroad is to cheapen us. This wasn't about selling us. And then in the early part of the century, if you recall, you had these discussions because we didn't understand public opinion very well and the adversarial use. We kept asking the question, why do they hate us? So let's have them like us more. Let's have them understand that Muslims have it great in America. That wasn't part of the question. That was our own manufacture. And we didn't understand these things because we just didn't internalize the role of information. In fact, we neutralized it. For example, the word information. This is why I don't like information warfare. Information is a munition. We neutralize this thing and we segregate it and we fail to integrate it. So when I was a governor of the BBG, I would go out into the field as often as possible. And one of the things I learned to do when I met with Post, and I always integrated the State Department in my conversations, and the Post. And I would ask the Post, the consulate or the embassy, I would like to meet with the public affairs officer, i.e. the public diplomacy officer, which is important, as I mentioned in the main part of the conversation. Those PAOs have never been renamed PDOs, they're public affairs. But I would ask to meet with the public affairs officer, the political affairs officer, and the military attaché. And I wouldn't specify how that meeting would take place, because what was evident was the relationship of these three people at the embassy. So in one example, the political officer and the public diplomacy officer were like best buds, and they collaborated on everything. And at another post, they wouldn't be in the same building with each other and could care less. In another meeting, I had a meeting with a European official, and all the information was astounding that this official was giving me. The public affairs officer was with me, taking copious notes. Everything was apparently brand new to this PAO. I come to find that within a couple of days, plus or minus, of that meeting, I think it was before, the political officer had written a cable detailing 90% of what I learned in that meeting. And the public affairs officer wasn't on the sign off on this cable and apparently had no idea about any of this stuff. And then the military attaché, I found, the defense attaché, the DAO, I found often had incredibly insightful information, even though their lane was completely different. But because these are national security issues, there were interesting things the DAO would bring up and be able to relate. And it was really fascinating. But these interactions are post-dependent. They're not institutionalized. It depends on who's there at that post.
Right.
And I found this fascinating. And that's just my incredibly minor anecdotal interaction.
Right. But what you were just describing, that was in the 2016?
That was the 2013 through 2016.
Okay. But
I was governor through January 2017.
Right. But you've got no reason to believe that those inconsistent dynamics are any different today than they were, say, 5-6 years ago, right?
Correct. I would say that there's zero reason to believe that they have changed, in part because of the challenges of the State Department. I can't see how they're trying to survive. But I can, and again, this was post-dependent.
How does the Global Engagement Center come into this whole discussion? My understanding is that the Global Engagement Center is a relatively new creation that has something to say about all of this, surely, right?
Yeah. The way I would frame GEC, Global Engagement Center, is it is primarily a product of the failure of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs to carry out the mission we collectively, quote, believe they should do. And let me unpack that. Most people don't think the Undersecretary should do that, and I think that's because they restrict their understanding of the Undersecretary's job to this narrow concept of public diplomacy. After all, the Undersecretary's title includes public diplomacy and public affairs. I argue, as well as colleagues, and a colleague and I, we've been trying to place an article on this, but nobody's wanted to take it up for weeks, that the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, Public Affairs is the State Department's chief international or global information operations officer. But for most of the history of this, in fact, the entire history of this position since 1999, so the past 22 years-ish, that's not what the position has been perceived as. And GEC is, in shorthand, I think you could say and should say, is that it was an attempt to recreate USIA, although a better model would be the International Information Administration within the State Department. And I say IIA because it was a quasi-independent agency within the State Department, whereas USIA was a separate federal agency. But the problem is that GEC has limited authorities, and I don't mean authorities as in who it can talk to. I mean, it doesn't actually have a lot of people. It doesn't actually have control over a lot of resources. Now, it has money to parcel out, but it's effectively a stopgap measure. And we forget that GEC was passed as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, actually as part, let me hold that thought. GEC was passed as an amendment to NDAA because there was a concern that GEC prior to that in 2016, starting in 2017, because GEC existed only through executive order, that GEC would cease to exist because the president, with a swipe of a pen, could eliminate GEC. And GEC's mission was expanded to include Russia through this amendment. Now, it's possibly relevant to your audience that this amendment by then Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Thornberry, was threatened with being blocked from the NDAA because the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Royce, wanted his amendment to abolish the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He threatened Thornberry that Thornberry's amendment, which was affecting the State Department, which is Royce's area, his Foreign Affairs Committee, he would argue, Royce would say, this is not germane because this should be under my committee, not yours, if you don't allow my amendment to abolish the board into the NDAA. Thornberry said, sure, expecting it to be stripped out in the Senate side. And I won't get into reasons why it appears that was not stripped out. Several people didn't act very well in that regard, is all I'll say. But so there's a relationship there, and this actually goes back to an earlier point that we didn't touch on as to why the Broadcasting Board of Governors got renamed to the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Well, because the board was abolished, so there's no more board, and so it became the Agency for Global Media. But there was this amendment to create GEC and make it permanent, because somebody might make it go away. But why does it exist in the first place? Why did it exist? Why did its predecessor, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, CSCC, exist? Because of deficiency in the State Department. Ostensibly, all these capabilities were there with the Bureau of International Information Programs, which is the largest rump, if you take out the capital cost of international broadcasting, the largest rump of USIA, IIP. Moved into state from USIA in 1999. And this had an incredible capability. And ostensibly, in fact, it for a long time had its own news operation. But it had a footprint and it was directly integrated with the State Department, a huge mass global footprint, operating in more places than the named BBG entity did. Because IIP was everywhere the State Department was and then some. Whereas BBG had a specific target audience, right?
Right.
But this IIP thing was mismanaged terribly, horribly. Marginalized, morale was shot. In fact, during the Obama administration, there was a coordinator for IIP, Jim Glassman, the last Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs under the Bush administration, was able to get this coordinator to be upgraded to assistant secretary. His successor did not use that assistant secretary seat because she did not want to put her choice for the heading IIP through the confirmation process, instead made a direct hire. I mention that because when the Office of OIG did their investigation into IIP, they had to extend the investigation because so many people in IIP had saved up so many materials and wanted to talk to OIG to complain about the leadership that it took longer to, it was just horribly mismanaged and nobody did anything about it. Wow. It was just a mess. And so there's no leadership and accountability. And so you have this trickling through, all the way through. There's the SETimes.com. IIP didn't want to take on SETimes.com. Why? Well, because DOD wanted too much leadership. I had a conversation with the DOD people, actually at Phoenix Challenge. They won't take this on. IIP wouldn't talk to PA, Public Affairs. The Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, I was sitting down meeting with him, who has a dotted line to the Assistant Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, although that's not a subordinate relationship because of the defects in thinking about global and non-US and US. And the IIP chief would not talk to the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. Why? Well, the IIP chief thought that PA wanted to take him over. There's no leadership. The stuff was just flowing around because nobody saw this stuff as important.
Yeah.
That's an ugly mess. And nobody gets into these things. They don't look at these issues. They just say, oh, this is the way it's working. Let me create this. Nobody attempts to fix the problem. They just, let's create a new box. Let's not understand why the defect is there.
Right. Wow. Well, as I mentioned at the top of this discussion, it is a big, sprawling topic that is challenging to get your arms around, or I should say for me, it's challenging for me to get my arms around. I really appreciate, Matt, you patiently engaging with my questions. Do you think, before we hop off, you could recommend to our audience a book or other online resource that might help interested audience members take a deeper dive into some of these very important topics?
So I want to thank you for the opportunity, and sorry, I don't have a clear policy prescriptive. And the main reason why I don't is because it doesn't matter what I think. You know, I'm focused more on the structural part. How do we, but the structure follows purpose. And if we don't have a purpose, and if we're just sort of bouncing, so I'm hoping people get educated and start to think about the right things here. And as far as a book, there are some contemporary books that look at pieces of this. Honestly, I have a real struggle. You asked before this conversation, we're talking about this. I really struggle because I think the contemporary authorship, except for some of them that are giving a nice analysis, like well, I think it's now a bit dated, but Chris Paul's strategic communication book, there is a real dearth of literature that really looks at the issues here. So, you know, if pressed, so I've got this one report, I mentioned it earlier, it took 6 months to write this. In its original version was 241 pages, but it's a publicly available version. And I use that term loosely because it's been out of print for a long time. Is only 135 pages, but it's the the memorandum on the post-war international information program of the United States. The public version is from December 45. Only about 100 copies, I think, were printed then. I have my physical copy here, which I had my staff at the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy scan and upload and post on the Advisory Commission website. I don't know if it's still there, but that gives an insight into the depth of analysis that I think is lacking. I think it's also instructive that took 6 months and it was deep interagency conversations during the war. This was January 1945 through July 1945. In fact, one of the meetings they had to discuss this at the State Department, a senior level meeting, was the day a B-17 or was it a B-25 flew into the Empire State Building. There was stuff going on. Another book, which I think is interesting, is something called the Overseas Information Service of the United States Government. And this is by a guy that was working in the State Department at the time of the first report. This is a Brookings Institution report, which is 397 pages. I have my copy right here, which again goes into this amazing detail. I think he wrote that in a year, in a way that is just incomprehensible. And then even things like Weapon on the Wall, Rethinking Psychological Warfare. This one's what, from the 50s? I think 59. There are some of these books that they're in the heat, and maybe it's because government was so much smaller, they didn't have to deal as much with it, the bureaucracy. But they get into some of these issues that some of which are highly relevant, some of which are not relevant to today, that I think are instructive. There's even this one by a psychological operations officer, James Warburg, the unwritten treaty. It's really interesting because he argues that we should have a treaty against influence operations against each other. Meanwhile, at about the same time, well, actually, this guy's book is 46. Yeah, at the same time, actually in 1945, the head of the Associated Press got in a tiff with Truman because Truman refused to make press freedom part of the peace treaties with the, quote, conquered nations. So there are some issues here that just aren't covered and discussed in the modern literature that I think are relative and instructive to our issues today, but are missed, which is one reason why I'm writing this book, and I've been writing this book for 10 years. So I don't have really a contemporary book, unfortunately. I've been dissatisfied. That doesn't mean it's not there, just I just don't have that recommendation. I've been unsatisfied because I see too many of these books skip over what I think, what I see are critical elements that help paint the trajectory, set and paint the trajectory that's just assumed.
Do you have a working title for your book and an estimate as to when it's going to be coming out?
So the working title is The Right to Know, The War of Words and the Origins and Evolution of the Smith-Mundt Act. Not particularly special, I suppose. Yeah. And I'm hoping it's out at the end of the year, or at least off my hands at the end of this year. And so in publication and available next year. I've been working on it over 10 years. And I think it's going to reset a lot of what I call the accepted wisdom around this legislation. There's language in there that's for dissemination abroad. These things are for dissemination abroad. Even I thought that, well, that meant that they didn't want a domestic. Well, no, for dissemination abroad was a blanket authority requested by the State Department, not a restriction imposed by Congress, because the State Department's authorities, just those three words, for dissemination abroad, just those three words, cut through a confusing array of authorities, pre-war authorities, that seem to limit State Department's ability to disseminate information to the Philippines, to Liberia, maybe Latin America, and that was it. And those three words allowed to go global. Mm-hmm. And there are a whole bunch of issues like that, the misunderstanding of what the legislation was for, the debates and conversations around it, that I think are useful lessons for today, as well as clarifying the purpose. Thornberry's amendment to Smith-Mundt was largely an effort to undo the perversion of the act by Fulbright and Zerinsky. Fulbright was trying to shut down USIA. He said the radios, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty, were Cold War relics in 1972. He said they should be, quote, they should be given the opportunity to take their rightful place in the graveyard of Cold War relics in 1972. Mm. He felt that they and USIA were instrumental in causing friction between Russia, who he believed was not a threat to the United States, and these were friction-producing entities. So we seem to have lost that and lost that understanding, to the effect that Smith-Mundt now grossly inhibits our global information engagement. In fact, distorts our understanding of what information is. and how you influence. Some of the activities that we see as cultural affairs now were intended as information programs and subtle influence operations. Not negative. Influence is not a bad word.
Right.
But we've been distorted by these things, our history, and we keep seeing law review articles that are absolutely terrible. They infuriate me every time I read another one. And they're so blatant and poorly written, but yet there are very few experts able to cut through. There's this one that's cited an incredible amount of times, and they recall this one line in this one book of how Smith-Mundt had to do with a reaction to Nazi propaganda. And that book just throws that one statement out there without any support or backing. And the reality is, yes, Smith-Mundt, there was an element of Nazi propaganda influencing Smith-Mundt, but not in the way that's implied. It was Nazi propaganda was effective in part because they eliminated the alternative voices. And we need to keep that freedom of information alive.
All right. Well, we will have links to those resources that you did mention in the show notes. And with that, Matt Armstrong, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.